Good morning, class. So we're moving on in this strength and conditioning course, and we're now getting to the point where we're going to start thinking about creating a program, which I hope is one of the concrete skills that you take from this class, is that you feel more confident writing an exercise program for any person, not necessarily an athlete, but even just a general population individual. Okay, so part of that is creating a warm-up. So that's what the focus of today's lecture is going to be about, which, it's kind of a simple topic, but there is definitely some science behind choosing to include certain things in a warm-up. And then there's an art to this as well. And that's kind of one thing I could say about program design. Yes, it's a science, but there's an art to it as well, right? And that learning how to do the art of program design really comes with experience. Okay, so what I like to do with students is, when I'm teaching you program design, is to keep it as simple as possible. Don't try to be artistic with it necessarily. Keep it simple. And then as you gain experience and you've actually participated in some programs yourself, which I would always recommend, then you start turning it into more of an art form where you're not just following a template by the book, but you're being a little bit more creative. And I guess that's kind of maybe a better word to use than artistic when we're talking about this particular topic. All right, so let's dive into the warm-up. First slide here is going to look at just some general benefits of warming up. You're going to engage your nervous system, right? If you just go from sitting to trying to do something explosive, your nervous system is really not going to be primed and ready to do that explosive move right away. So priming your system by doing some activities to sort of get your nervous system warmed up will allow you to produce more force when you're actually doing the activity, right? Your reaction time will be better as well because your nervous system is sort of firing at that faster rate that's going to be required to do the training or play the sport, whatever it might be. Okay, I skipped the first bullet point, but this one is very much related. Is your muscles obviously need to be warmed up in terms of their activation as well. So when you're just sitting or standing, those motor neurons are not firing at all, right? So again, you shouldn't expect them to be able to go from not firing at all to maximal firing rate. So doing some sort of warm-up activity will get those motor neurons firing, sending that signal from the nervous system to the muscles, and that'll get them primed and ready for that maximal force production. Okay, that kind of dovetails into the third bullet point here, which would allow you to produce more power and strength, or produce more force once the nervous system is activated and ready to reach those maximal levels of exertion. Okay, by doing some submaximal muscle contraction, we're going to produce heat, right? And we haven't talked about this much in class yet, but when you're producing ATP, there is a byproduct that is produced, and that byproduct is heat. Okay, only about 25% of the energy that we're producing actually goes toward the production of work. The other 75% roughly just dissipates as heat. Okay, so that heat moves into the muscle and it heats it up, and that's a good thing to a certain extent, because heating tissue is going to make it more pliable. It's going to make it less viscous, is the word that they use here on this slide. So you're heating that tissue up, you're going to make it more pliable, and it's going to be easier to contract and relax that muscle with a greater rate of speed if the muscle is more pliable or less viscous. Okay. Another thing that aids in that is the next bullet point, which is increasing blood flow to the muscles, right? That's going to heat it up. That's also going to make sure that you're delivering more nutrients and fuel to the muscle and removing waste, which again is going to just facilitate greater rates of muscle contraction, okay? That dovetails into the next bullet point. So the more oxygen and other nutrients we have available, the greater our metabolic systems can can function, or the more efficiently they can function. And then the byproducts or the waste products they're creating, such as lactic acid, carbon dioxide, etc., can be more efficiently removed if there is enhanced blood flow to the muscle already there, okay? And then lastly, there's the psychological effect of how does that occur? Well, when you're moving around, your sympathetic nervous system activates, right? And that increases your alertness and increases your arousal, as kind of like we talked about in the psychology chapter. And that also gets you more prepared to participate in whatever the physical activity is that you're warming up for, okay? So these are some good general purposes that we like to talk about for a warm-up. So another thing to consider is a general versus a specific warm-up, okay? Now, for the most part, what we just talked about here, you know, some of these bullet points can be accomplished through a general warm-up, okay? And I might describe a general warm-up as jogging, riding a bike, basically any form of normal cardiovascular exercise, okay? You know, that's going to increase blood flow. That's going to increase muscle temperature. That's going to enhance metabolic reaction, enhance sympathetic nervous system elevation. General warm-ups may not, however, accomplish these first three bullet points, right? We might need more specific muscle actions as part of our warm-up to accomplish those first three bullet points on the slide that we see here, okay? So that's something that we want to consider, okay? And that's going to really be largely based upon what athlete you're working with or what type of activity that you're preparing for, right? If you're playing a sport that involves a lot of jumping, such as volleyball, basketball, then you would want to choose some warm-up exercises that are specific for those sports. And by that, I would mean you would want to include some jumping exercises, right? You always want to think about the movements that are included for the activity or the sport. And in your warm-up, you want to do some movements that mimic the activities that you're going to be doing in the sport, right? So to go back to the general warm-up question or definition, yes, you're going to be jogging in a sport to some extent, but that's not a real specific movement for that sport. You know, cycling is certainly not specific for any sport unless you're just cycling as your sport, right? So kind of the conventional recommendation is to do first some sort of general warm-up, and the go-to time is typically like 5 minutes. You want to do about 5 minutes of a general warm-up, and again, that will help us accomplish these first 4 bullet points, you know. And you could argue maybe I should have flipped these, and in retrospect, I probably should have. I probably should have listed these 4 first. And then your specific warm-up would come after the general warm-up, and that would accomplish the first 3 bullet points that we see on this slide here, okay? We're going to talk about how we might want to incorporate stretching, right? Stretching is sort of a debated topic about when is the best time to do stretching. We'll talk about that a little bit as we go, but just to kind of throw out a couple things now. First of all, muscles are going to be best stretched when they're warm, okay? So you could argue stretching after the general warm-up is going to be more beneficial than before the general warm-up, certainly. A lot of people think that for that reason that you might stretch after your workout in general. Stretching after the workout is more important than before the workout because of those factors. There is also the factor that real aggressive stretching can actually reduce force production because muscles are going to produce more force when they have this optimal amount of overlap between the myofilaments, actin and myosin. If you stretch the muscle, then you lose that optimal overlap and your ability to produce maximal force could be compromised, okay? So what's the answer? It's going to depend. And I know you all hate that answer, but that's kind of it. So personally, what I like to go to is you do a general warm-up, you do your specific what we might call a dynamic warm-up, which we'll get to next. And you incorporate some stretches, dynamic stretches, into that dynamic warm-up. And then after your workout, you do the more traditional static stretching, okay? So let's transition now to talking about that specific warm-up a little bit more. And that specific warm-up, as I just said, can be called a dynamic warm-up. So how long should the warm-up take? Sorry, I got a little bit out of order here. As I mentioned, the general warm-up may last about 5 to 10 minutes. And then your specific warm-up or this dynamic warm-up could last maybe another 10 minutes, okay? Now, I know what you're thinking, right? You don't want to waste a lot of time, that much time, doing a warm-up. And I understand where you're coming from. And I would even say that younger individuals may not need that long. But older individuals, and by older individuals, I'll even throw myself into that category. I'm 45. The warm-up takes on a much greater importance the older a person gets. The warm-up for me is probably the longest part of my workout at this point, because the body just needs more time to accomplish these tasks that we identified on this very first slide that we saw here, okay? So now, I'm sorry, I went a little out of order there. Now we're going to get to the talk of the specific dynamic warm-up, okay? Another term that has become popular to describe the specific warm-up is what is known as the ramp protocol, okay? So ramp warm-up includes the following components, okay? So the R stands for raising. So we're going to raise body temperature, heart rate, respiration, blood flow, etc. And again, a lot of that can be done by the general warm-up, but also by some lower intensity specific exercises as well, okay? And we'll talk about how to choose those exercises here in just a little bit, okay? The A and the M stand for activate and mobilize, okay? So we're going to activate specific muscles and we're going to mobilize those muscles through a full range of motion. So again, that is best accomplished by picking specific exercises that mimic the muscle actions and ranges of motion that you're going to be doing in your workout or as a part of your sport, okay? So that kind of goes back to what I mentioned with regards to jumping. Like if you're playing volleyball or basketball, there's going to be quite a bit of jumping involved. So the muscles that you're going to use and the ranges of motion you're going to use to jump in your sport, you should practice as part of this ramp protocol, okay? Now, I can't really demonstrate anything for you well right now, but imagine, you know, when you're jumping in basketball, you don't do like a full depth squat and then jump from that position. So you don't necessarily need a full range of motion squat jump as in your warm-up because you're not going to do that in the activity. More likely, you're going to do what's called a quarter squat jump, where you just slightly dip the hips down and bend the knees, and then you explode up as high as you can. So ultimately, I would say you would want to incorporate both, right? If you do a few full squat jumps, that's going to really effectively stretch the muscles, activate them, but then transition to doing some more quarter squat, half squat jumps, because that's going to be more similar to what you're going to do as part of the activity once you get to that point, okay? And then the P stands for potentiate, which is basically, again, another way to describe getting the nervous system activated and primed in the motor units that you're going to use in the activity, primed and ready to be used as well. And again, that's going to go back to picking specific movements that you're going to use in the sport and practicing them to a lower intensity for the most part as part of your warm-up, okay? So what I have here is just a giant list of some potential exercises that you could choose as part of your warm-up, okay? Now, I know I gave you some time frames on a previous slide. I'm just going to jump back there really quick. The general warm-up, 5 to 10 minutes. Your whole body warm-up, 15 to 20 minutes. I kind of think 15 minutes is a good time to bracket your warm up, right? So if we do 5 minutes of some low intensity cardio first, just to sort of increase body temperature, and then we designate 10 minutes for a specific warm up, that's a good time frame to use. 15 minutes is a reasonable time for a warm up, in my opinion. Okay, so if we go to this list, 10 minutes is not going to be long enough to do all of these. And you don't need to do all of these, right? I'm giving you this menu. And what do you usually do with the menu? You pick things off the menu that you want. Okay, so the same would apply with this menu, right? You would consider your athlete. And in fact, for the critical thinking assignment this week, I'm going to ask you to pick an athlete type, whatever you want to pick. Okay, consider what movements the athlete does in that sport. And then I want you to select 5 exercises off of this list, okay? Or if you want to go off the list, that's fine too. If you have some things, if you play a sport and you know some things that you do when you warm up, you can use those. That's totally fine. I'm just giving this list to the students who don't know what to do for a warm up, okay? So think about what movements are included for that sport, and you're going to pick, for your critical thinking assignment, 5 exercises off that list, and you're going to include those 5 exercises as part of your dynamic warm-up, okay? Now, in reality, I might pick anywhere from 5 to 10. It would just depend on how much time I have, how familiar my athlete is with the exercises. People who are more experienced, they can usually do things faster. Where if they're unexperienced and I have to teach them the movements, I would choose less exercises because it's going to take me more time. It's going to take them more time to do each exercise because I'm going to have to teach it to them first. Okay, so as their experience level grows, you can, of course, increase the number of exercises you do in your warm-up. So let me just give you an example, and I'm just going to stick with the basketball player example. Okay, so we've done our general warm-up. So if I had to pick, 5 exercises that I would use, I'm just going to scan this list here. I mean, jumping jacks could be one, right? That's a low intensity jump. That's maybe a basic. And I guess that's another thing I should say as well. Less experienced athletes choose more basic warm-up exercises, and more advanced athletes, you can choose more advanced exercises. So if I had a basketball team of like elementary school kids, jumping jacks would be a great choice, right? But if I had like a college basketball team, jumping jacks are pretty basic, so I might choose something different, all right? But that's one I could pick. Let's keep going down. Ankle rolls, that for basketball, right, rolling ankles is a common injury. So making sure that I work that ankle through a full range of motion, increase the blood flow to that area, reduce the tissue viscosity, that's an important exercise for a basketball team, for sure. So there's 2. Sorry, I'm not talking because I'm just sort of reading. Lunging, any sort of lunging is always a good exercise with any sport where there's, forward and lateral movement. Okay, that's going to be a good one. Groiner, which is sort of a lunge that you do with a really wide step to stretch the inner thigh muscles. That is an area that can commonly be injured with basketball players, so that could be another good one. Okay. What else? The Heidi Crossover. So there's a lot of change of direction with basketball players. So practicing some crossover moves, that would be another good exercise. And then let's pick one more. I don't see a jumping exercise on this list, so I'm just going to throw the quarter squat jumps on. Now, this list is incomplete, right? There's probably like what 20. There's probably 40 exercises listed here. We could easily have a menu of 200 exercises, okay? So just keep that in mind. This is a limited list, as I just showed you by indicating that there's not squat jumps on it, okay? So again, when you're doing a critical thinking assignment, You can pick things off this list, or if you know some exercises that you do as part of your sport or from your own workouts, you can use those as well, okay? Now, you're going to be asked, so if we scroll ahead here, I'll come back to that. Here's a sample workout. Now, I want to have you all kind of mimic this. You only have to do the first column. What they do here is they progress and have the people do, they have the athletes do a little bit longer per chunk of time. All I need you to do is 1 week's worth. Okay, so just you'll prescribe though a number of sets and either reps or time for each of the exercises that you pick. Okay, 30 seconds is a good standard time. So if you want to go with that, that is okay as well. Or I tend to always go with 10 is a nice round number. Is you're going to do reps. So if we go back to the menu, and let's say that you pick ankle roll. You can have your athlete do 10 reps each direction on each side. Okay, so I don't know if that's listed here. If you do pick an exercise where you have to do the right and left sides independently, you would write an each after it. Or I like to write like a capital E, okay? And that's, there's a lot of shorthand I like to use when I'm writing programs, and I'll teach you guys that, or you all that, in a couple weeks, but that's just one thing I would do, right? So indicate if it's right and left or independently done, that you do each to indicate you have to do each side for 30 seconds or each side for 10 reps, okay? So again, this is a sample menu or a sample workout, warm-up workout. So when you're doing yours for your critical thinking assignment, again, you can sort of mimic what is done here, okay? But make it specific to whatever athlete it is that you want to write your warm-up for, okay? Now, one thing we haven't talked about yet is written here, and that's foam rolling. Foam rolling is sometimes referred to as myofascial release, okay? Now, I don't know if any of you have done this. I'm guessing a lot of you probably have if you are an athlete, if you play on a team at Central State. You probably do some foam rolling, or another way to do it is using like a lacrosse ball or some sort of ball that is hard. This is also good to do as part of a warm-up, especially the older you get. Again, this is like a foundation of my own personal warm-up. Where you put it doesn't necessarily matter, right? You don't have to put it in a certain place. I do like where they have foam rolling on this sample. Now, personally, as I've gotten older, I do foam rolling first, then I get into the rest of my warm-up. But again, that's just personal choice. You don't have to do it that way, okay? I think the reason I do that is because I have some soreness in certain areas of my body that is present like every day. So knocking it out or helping to alleviate it with the foam roller is very helpful. So I'm just sort of accustomed to doing that first, no matter whenever I work out. With younger athletes, that might not be required, okay? But again, a lot of you probably know, you probably have areas in your body, muscles, that are typically sore, right? Doing some foam rolling on those sore areas can help them recover faster and help alleviate that pain and get those muscles ready to contribute to whatever workout you're doing. So it is an important thing to include, absolutely, okay? And again, the amount you do is going to vary based upon a lot of factors, the age of the person, where they have soreness, etc., right? Foam rolling could last anywhere from 1 minute to 10 minutes on its own. Again, it just depends upon the individual. But you notice here, and I like what they've done, basically they're going to do one set of 30 seconds on each of the muscle groups that is listed here, okay? Now, I did not say that you all have to include foam rolling as part of your critical thinking assignment, but if you want to, you can, okay? So you can do general warm-up, foam rolling, and then choose your 5 exercises. It's totally up to you. And this slide just shows some common ways that foam rolling is done, right? You want to usually do it on soft tissue. So you notice that this athlete, she's doing the glutes. This one is doing the lats. using a ball allows you to get a little bit more targeted. So if you want to get like a smaller muscle, such as, you know, this guy, it looks like he's targeting like his external shoulder rotators, which are very tight. If you haven't used a lacrosse ball on your shoulder rotators, try it and see how much it hurts. And if it hurts, that means you need to do it. So just use that as a guide. Because, you know, for most people, like personally, when I roll my glutes, it doesn't hurt. So I don't, that kind of tells me I don't really need to do it that often. But if I turned and did my IT band, it is very painful. And again, that's an indication that you need to do it more often. So foam rolling can kind of be a learning experience with an athlete or with yourself. You're going to kind of experiment and you'll learn the areas that you want to target with a given athlete or with yourself as well. So let's transition then. Before I do that, I guess I just want to wrap up the warm-up. So again, it's recommended that you're going to do a general warm-up first, lasting 5 to 10 minutes, and that can be running, cycling, rowing, you know, some sort of basic cardiovascular activity. You then may include foam rolling there if you want. You don't have to. And then you're going to then you're going to get into your specific warm-up, which would consist of really a series of exercises that look like this, okay? Now, as we transition to flexibility, I will say that you can do some flexibility exercises as part of your warm-up, okay? Again, I'll just kind of use myself as an example. There's several muscles that I have that are always very tight. You know, I do foam roll those as part of my warm-up. And then as I'm doing my dynamic warm-up, let's just, for example, I'll do a set of jumping jacks to get my heart rate up, and then I'll get on the floor and do a dynamic stretch, or a static stretch, I should say. Sorry, a static stretch for whatever muscle is very tight, okay? So I said you didn't want to aggressively do static stretching pre-workout, but incorporating some as part of your warm-up is appropriate, again, depending upon the needs of the athlete, right? If you have an athlete that doesn't really have any flexibility issues, you don't have to do that. But if you have an athlete who does have flexibility issues in certain areas, then you would include some of those, okay? Now, I know this is confusing, but I think this really speaks to the idea that a program, even a warm-up, has to be individualized for the person, right? A true professional would not write one program and use it with 20 people, because each of those 20 people is different, and they have different needs, and they have different muscles that are tight, they have different muscles that are weak, right? Program design needs to be individualized. Now, what I'm going to show you all in a couple weeks is you can use a template, okay, which is the same for every person, but then you individualize within the template based upon the needs of the individual. And in this workout here, this is a good example. This could be a template, one general, one foam rolling, 8 dynamic exercises. That's the template. You're going to plug in, based on the individual needs, what mode are you going to use for your general warm-up. Maybe you're going to run, maybe you're going to bike. Again, based on the needs of the individual. For your foam rolling, each individual is going to have different needs, so you choose a few muscle groups based upon the needs of that individual. Then, again, you're going to choose a series of warm-up exercises, specific warm-up exercises to meet the needs of the individual, right? So again, this is kind of part of the art I was talking about earlier. There's an art to program design, which makes it a skill that can be difficult for students to grasp initially, but I think if you kind of understand the concept of what I'm saying, then it's going to make a lot more sense, okay? And we'll get into that a lot more in the coming weeks once we get to actual program design. But this is sort of this is like, we're talking about the warm-up. This is a warm-up for program design, right? Because this is essentially like a miniature program that we're building. It's just going to be based upon a warm-up only. Okay, so flexibility. We have a few different definitions of flexibility. I've mentioned static versus dynamic stretching already today. Static flexibility refers to basically just holding a stretch for a prolonged period of time. 30 seconds is a typical time duration. Where dynamic flexibility is more moving a muscle through a range of motion, full range of motion, rapidly in a rhythmic fashion, okay? So again, you would be well to include both. Often, dynamic flexibility is more used in the warm-up, or static flexibility is more used in the cool-down. Okay, that's kind of a general rule of thumb. But again, as I indicated, some individuals might need some static flexibility exercises in their warm-up, just depending upon their individual needs. What are some factors that affect flexibility? So we see on this slide and the next one several things that are listed. Okay, I'm going to run through these pretty quickly, some of the key ones. First of all, the joint structure is going to influence the range of motion. The best example of this is looking at the ball and socket joint versus the hinge joint. Your knee and your elbow are hinges. Your shoulder and your hip are ball and socket joints. Ball and socket joints have a greater range of motion because of the type of the structure of the joint, where a hinge joint only moves in one range of motion. So the overall flexibility is going to typically be less based upon the type of joint it is. Okay. I'm going to skip this one for now and jump down here and talk about the amount of muscle and connective tissue that surrounds a joint. And again, I'm going to talk about the ball and socket. Shoulder and hip are the places we have ball and sockets. Typically, the hip has less range of motion than the shoulder, even though they're the same type of joint, but because there's more muscle and connective tissue around the hip, right, versus the shoulder. So therefore, that increased amount of tissue around the hip is going to reduce its range of motion slightly compared to the shoulder, which has less tissue around it, right? Why is there less tissue around it? Well, the hip is a load-bearing joint and the shoulder is not, right? So load-bearing joints are going to have more tissue around them. You can also generate more force there as well, okay? Now, as far as age and sex go, typically females are more flexible than males, but not always. Again, it depends upon the individual. But in general, a couple things. Males typically have more muscle mass than females. More mass is going to reduce flexibility, so that's a factor. There is also the fact that the hormones in the female body tend to contribute to more flexible tissue versus the male hormones, and that is to eventually prepare the female body for childbirth, right? Which requires some flexibility. As far as age goes, typically we do see a decline in flexibility with age. However, that can largely be mitigated by staying physically active, right? Typically, as people get older, they become less physically active. That has a dramatic impact on flexibility. Where if they stay physically active, they can help. They're going to still lose some. There is some age-related decline in tissue quality and elasticity, but staying active and challenging your muscles to still move through a full range of motion, you can retain a lot of your flexibility with age, okay? I'm going to skip the others and then go down here to the last one, because that's kind of what I was just referring to. Is activity level, I put an asterisk by that one because that tends to be the most important, okay? Being physically active can really override any of the other factors that we talked about. A physically active older person can be more flexible than a sedentary younger person. A physically active male can be more flexible than a sedentary female. Okay. Physical activity is the most important factor determining flexibility. So there's a question on the lecture study questions to ask you, which is the most important, and I'm telling you it's this one. So over the next few slides, it's going to talk about, programs for flexibility. I don't really want to focus too much on this other than to say, to really see benefits in flexibility, you want to hold stretches for anywhere from 15 to 30 seconds, right? And you're going to progress. So with the beginner, start at 15 and progress to 30 seconds, holding a stretch in a position of mild discomfort. So not in a position of pain, in a position of mild discomfort. When should an athlete stretch? Again, I've already addressed this. It's going to depend upon the person, but typically there is some stretching done pre-activity, so before practice, although all of these are talking about post-practice. So the conventional modern line of thinking is to shift most stretching to after practice. However, as I've indicated to you before today already, there is definitely a place for some stretching prior to activity as well. The amounts are going to really vary based upon the needs of the individual. Do athletes need separate sessions for stretching? Again, that's going to be based on the needs of the individual. You may have an athlete who's very, very tight. And if you have an athlete such as that, then yes, they might use a designated session. Older people, you know, for me, even at 45, like I said, I could probably just stretch only and get more benefit than if I stretched and tried to run or something. Because the older body, you know, it changes, right? So it's going to really depend greatly on the need. You know, for a younger active individual, they probably do not need dedicated stretching sessions, but as people get older, or if they do have low flexibility, designated stretching sessions could be used and recommended there. So I want to finish the lecture today by talking about a specific type of stretch, and this is known as Pnf stretching, or proprioceptive neuromuscular facilitation. And what we're going to be looking to sort of take advantage of with that type of stretching is the stretch reflex, okay? And something that you might be familiar with in that when a muscle is stretched, there is force production is automatically upregulated to that muscle, okay? But then also the opposite muscle on the other side of the body tends to relax, okay? So for example, if I aggressively stretch my quad, the force production in the quad is gonna increase, but then the hamstring muscle is gonna relax, okay? So the thought behind this is then if we wanna be better at stretching our hamstrings, we can contract our quadriceps while we're stretching our hamstrings, because that contraction of the quad is going to lead to reflexive relaxation of the hamstring, okay? So we're going to see in a few minutes a couple slides that kind of indicate how this type of stretching is done. And again, some of you may have seen this. Before we get to that, though, I'm just going to sort of review the different types of stretching. Again, a static stretch is a slow stretch that you hold for a period of time, and this is often done in isolation by yourself. Okay. A ballistic stretch is one where there is more of a bouncing type of movement, and that is not recommended necessarily. Visualize somebody who's trying to they're seated and they're trying to stretch out and reach for their toes, but they're like bouncing back and forth. That does not accomplish much at all. Okay. Holding the position for time is going to accomplish more. Okay. Then we also have the dynamic stretching, which maybe I've referred to previously. These are the types of stretches that are often incorporated in dynamic warm-ups, where you are kind of thinking about a sports-specific stretch and you're doing it for repetitions through a full range of motion. You're not doing the bouncy short range of motions, but you're doing a full range of motion through that activity. Let me just see if I can give you an example of like an arm hug is a dynamic stretch, right? Where you're full range of motion, stretching the pecs as I go back, but then I'm contracting them, and this is a full range of motion. This is a good example of a dynamic stretch, right? Where a ballistic stretch would be more like this, just trying to stretch the pecs in that way. That's not going to accomplish much, but the dynamic stretch, moving through the full range of motion, is effective. That's also going to increase blood flow, heart rate, etc. That's why those types of stretches are typically done as part of a warm-up, where static stretches are then done at the end as you're trying to cool down and your body is already nice and warm and you want it to start to cool down. So here's some steps about how to do a static stretch. I'm not going to read that one. You can read that on your own. Here are some guidelines for how to do dynamic stretching. And then this is the part I wanted to focus on. So what we see listed on the next few slides, and I'm gonna scroll through them quickly and then come back to them, is what is known as this Pnf stretching, okay? Where you typically do this with a partner, and the idea is to contract the muscle, the agonist muscle, while stretching the antagonist, okay? So there's a few methods that this can be done. We have the hold relax or the contract relax, okay? So what we see on this slide here first is the hold relax, okay? So this is again done with the partner. We are stretching hamstrings in this way. So what we're doing is the muscle is moved into position to be stretched, and it is held in that position. Once it is held in that position for a period of time, we then have a reflexive relaxation of that muscle, and then the muscle is actively stretched by the partner once that relaxation has occurred, okay? This would be a good starting place before then transitioning to what's known as the contract relax method. This is a little bit more intense, okay? Where you first actively stretch the muscle, okay? And then the person who's being stretched is going to contract that muscle by pushing back against the partner for 5 to 10 seconds, okay? Once that contraction is released, we're then going to have reflexive relaxation of that muscle, at which point the partner is going to be able to stretch the leg even farther. So just notice sort of the angle that it is achieved. There is a stretch achieved here, but then after this contraction, the muscle, the hamstring, is going to relax, causing the stretch to be used through an even greater range of motion, right? So this is an effective way to improve flexibility. Maybe more effective than static stretching because you can often, through the use of a partner, move muscles through a greater range of motion, right? So this is not recommended typically to be done pre-workout. This would be something you would do post-workout. And honestly, if you get into doing personal training and you're working with individual clients, you as the personal trainer can fulfill this role as the partner and stretch your clients. And this is an effective way to get your hands on them, which is always good to do in the professional setting. Like, you're going to build more value in your services if you do things like this for your clients versus if you just stand there and tell them what to do, right? They're going to perceive more value in paying you as the trainer if you're doing some sort of partner stretching with them at the end of a workout, right? So from a business perspective, this is a good method to use as well. So here's a list of different stretches that you can do, different areas of the body that can be stretched. In the next several slides, go through what that might look like. Again, I'm going to scroll through these quickly and just kind of give you all an idea of the different types of stretches. In all of these cases, you can do the contract relax method, right? So in this instance, the athlete might try to elevate the knees against the resistance for 5 to 10 seconds and then relax, and then the partner would push the knees down to really stretch those adductors. Here is a quad hip flexor stretch, shoulder stretch, and that's the end, okay? So again, the procedure that kind of is gone through that I described to you in these pictures can then be applied to the rest of these as well, right? So we're talking about a contraction of the muscle for 5 to 10 seconds against partner resistance. Then the athlete relaxes and the partner stretches that muscle that was previously being contracted but is now relaxing. And again, the theory behind that is after there is a concentric muscle action that is held, that the muscle relaxes to a greater extent, allowing for a greater range of motion to be achieved. Okay? So that brings us to the end of this PowerPoint. Now I do have, just quickly, a supplemental PowerPoint that is available for you all to see in the weekly folder. And what this is just basically a big PowerPoint full of pictures of different stretches. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this, but this gives you all an idea of, you can name a stretch anything. You'll see 1,000 different names for a given stretch, but just an idea of what a particular stretch might be called, how it's done. So again, when you're doing your critical thinking assignment, if you want to include some stretches, you can do that as well. You could kind of browse this and pick some that are appropriate for the given athlete that you have chosen to write your warm-up about. And as we get later into this is showing some dynamic warm-up exercises. Walking knee hugs, lunge with the overhead side reach, just a basic walking lunge. These are all great exercises to include in a dynamic warm-up. This is a really good one that's good for stretching the groin, getting the adductors loose as part of your dynamic warm-up. Heel to toe walk, walking over and under hurdles. These are good dynamic warm-up exercises. So some of the exercises that were in that list that I showed you in the last PowerPoint, they are visibly shown here on this supplemental PowerPoint. A lot of good ones there. Okay, so and again, that's a limited list, but we could have thousands of slides because there are a lot of warm-up exercises. Really, you're only limited by your own imagination when it comes to warm-up exercises. Okay, so that brings us to a conclusion today. You do have your lecture study questions, and then your critical thinking assignment is again asking you to pick an athlete, type, and write a dynamic warm-up for that person. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'll come back and talk to you all next week. Take care.